14 years ago, two adult backpackers vanished from what should have been the safest place they had all night. Their tent at an established campsite in the Big Bend National Park area of Texas. It happened in 2012. Deep in a landscape they knew how to navigate. After a long day on desert trails that demanded respect but promised solitude. At first, authorities leaned toward the simplest explanation: a voluntary delay, a misjudged route, an overnight extension that had not been properly reported. But from the beginning, there was one ranger who could not accept that answer. Big Bend is the kind of place where time stretches and sound thins out. In 2012, its vastness still felt largely untouched by constant digital tracking or real-time check-ins. Evan Reyes and Liam Porter had come there for that reason. They were physically capable, meticulously prepared, and known among friends for choosing multi-day wilderness treks that tested endurance rather than comfort. Their gear was current, their maps marked, their water planned down to the liter. They did not wander casually. They calculated 14 years would pass before a routine modern process, one so ordinary it rarely inspires fear, would quietly collide with a trace left behind in the desert that spring. When it did, it would force investigators to reopen a case most people had quietly filed away as another example of nature swallowing answers whole. The collision would not happen in the desert. It would happen indoors, under fluorescent lights, inside a system designed to organize lives rather than unravel them. In 2012, Evan and Liam were defined by motion. They planned trips months in advance, trained for elevation changes, and favored terrain that demanded mental discipline as much as physical stamina. Big Bend offered all of that. Sharp temperature swings, exposed ridgelines, long stretches without shade, and nights so quiet they could feel unreal. The park's remoteness was not a risk to them. It was the point. Their routines were deliberate. Early starts before the heat settled in. Midday rests where the rock threw a thin line of shade. Evenings spent checking gear, rationing water, and logging distances in small notebooks kept dry in sealed bags. They favored established backcountry campsites precisely because those spaces offered predictability in an unpredictable environment. A flat patch of ground, known landmarks, clear expectations about where others might pass through. On their final night, the desert air cooled quickly after sunset. The wind dropped. The sky sharpened into something almost metallic with stars. Nothing in the hours leading up to dawn suggested danger. No storms, no reported wildlife incidents, no alerts from other hikers in the area. By every measurable standard, Evan and Liam were exactly where they were supposed to be. What no one could explain, then or now, was how two experienced hikers could disappear without triggering the usual signs of wilderness loss. No erratic route deviations, no abandoned trail, no distress signals, and no sign that either of them chose to leave that campsite on their own. 14 years later, a preserved detail from that night would surface again, forcing a reckoning with assumptions made in the quiet aftermath of their disappearance. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? In 2012, Evan Reyes and Liam Porter approached the desert with a discipline that bordered on ritual. Preparation was not just practical for them. It was part of the experience. Weeks before the trip, they reviewed topographic maps of Big Bend National Park, tracing elevation gains with their fingers, circling water sources, debating daily mileage. They chose routes that balanced challenge with realism, never pushing so far that fatigue would erode judgment. Friends knew them as cautious without being timid, confident without being reckless. Their daily rhythm on the trail was steady and predictable. Wake before sunrise, pack while the air still held a trace of cold, boots crunching softly on gravel as they moved out before the sun cleared the ridgelines. They hiked in measured stretches, stopping to adjust packs, check compass bearings, and log time and distance. Meals were utilitarian, eaten quietly, often sitting on rocks that still radiated warmth from the day. Conversation tended toward logistics rather than philosophy. Out there, focus mattered. That final stretch of their trip followed the same pattern. They selected an established backcountry campsite, known for its relative shelter and proximity to a marked trail. The site sat in a shallow basin, bordered by low scrub and weathered stone. The ground was compacted from years of careful use. From the tent, the view opened toward distant ridges that glowed faintly at dusk. It was not isolated in the absolute sense, but it was far enough from high-traffic areas to feel private. Their gear was arranged methodically. Packs leaned against a rock outcrop. Boots were placed just outside the tent opening, toes facing inward. Headlamps were stored in easy reach. Water containers were sealed and lined up, ready for the morning. Nothing suggested haste or disorder. This was not a campsite abandoned in panic. It was one prepared for another ordinary dawn. Around them, the desert settled into its nighttime quiet. Insects replaced the daytime wind. A distant animal call echoed once, then faded. Temperatures dropped quickly, as expected. Inside the tent, Evan and Liam rested in sleeping bags designed for the conditions, bodies tired but uninjured. There were no reports from nearby hikers of raised voices, arguments, or unusual movement. The park log recorded no late-night disturbances. Everything about the evening aligned with routine, yet subtle vulnerabilities existed, the kind that only become visible in hindsight. The campsite's location, while established, sat near a narrow access path used occasionally by rangers and maintenance crews. Foot traffic there was infrequent but not unheard of. In 2012, there were no motion sensors, no perimeter alerts, no requirement to log exact arrival or departure times at individual campsites. The backcountry operated largely on trust and self-dash reporting. Their tent, lightweight and designed for airflow, could be opened quietly. The desert's vast acoustics meant that sound traveled unpredictably. Footsteps could vanish into the open air or be mistaken for wildlife shifting through brush. In a place where isolation was expected, presence was easy to misinterpret or dismiss. Sometime between the last stars overhead and the first thin light of dawn, that fragile sense of safety would collapse. But at the close of that evening, nothing marked it as different from dozens of nights Evan and Liam had spent outdoors before. The desert held its breath. The campsite remained still, and the routines that had always carried them safely through would, for the first time, fail without warning. On the final morning of their trip, 2012 moved forward like any other day Evan Reyes and Liam Porter had spent in the desert. The sun rose on schedule, light spilling across the basin where their campsite sat, illuminating scrub, stone, and the pale dust of the trail. By 5:30 a.m., nearby hikers were already stirring, the faint clink of cookware and the soft zip of tent fabric carrying briefly through the still air. In Big Bend, mornings belonged to those who respected the heat to come. Inside Evan and Liam's tent, time did not move forward at all. The night before had unfolded without incident. By 9:40 p.m., their headlamps were off. The campsite log later confirmed no recorded movement in or out of the area after that hour. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, settling into a predictable range for that season. Wind remained low. The conditions were stable, forgiving by desert standards. Sometime in the early pre-dawn hours, likely between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., something disrupted that stillness. No one could say exactly what it was. No one heard shouting. No emergency beacon was triggered. No satellite device pinged distress. Whatever occurred happened, quietly enough to leave the desert undisturbed, and efficiently enough to leave no immediate alarm. When the first hiker passed the campsite shortly after sunrise, the absence went unnoticed. A tent standing at dawn did not look unusual. Packs leaned where they had been left, From a distance, it appeared as though its occupants were simply sleeping in. By 7:15 a.m., the trail had warmed, and foot traffic increased. Still, no one looked closely. It was not until mid-morning that concern surfaced. A ranger doing a routine sweep noticed something subtle but wrong. The tent was closed, but the boots outside had not moved. Condensation still clung to the fabric, untouched. The sun had shifted far enough that any late sleepers would normally be awake, especially two hikers known for early starts. The ranger called out. There was no response. When the tent was finally opened, it was empty. Sleeping bags were partially unzipped, as if left in a hurry, but not violently disturbed. Headlamps remained inside. Wallets, identification, and most personal items were still there. There was no sign of a planned departure, no packed gear, no trail notes, no indication of a morning routine underway. Evan and Liam had not stepped out to relieve themselves or start breakfast. They had vanished from the space where they should have been most protected. As word spread, unease replaced confusion. Rangers checked the immediate area, scanning for footprints, drag marks, or signs of wildlife interference. What they found did not fit an accident. No blood, no torn fabric, no indication of a struggle with an animal. The ground around the tent showed disturbed dust, compressed in a pattern that suggested more than one set of adult footsteps, moving away from the campsite in a deliberate direction. By noon, the tone shifted. This was no longer a matter of hikers running late. The possibility that Evan and Liam had simply wandered off weakened with every detail that refused to align. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. By early afternoon, the first patrol vehicles arrived. Radios crackled. A perimeter was discussed. The desert, vast and indifferent, absorbed the urgency without revealing anything in return. Search efforts began with urgency sharpened by disbelief. By early afternoon in 2012, Big Bend National Park shifted from a place of quiet recreation to a coordinated emergency zone. Rangers, deputies, and volunteer searchers gathered near the trailhead, studying maps spread across the hoods of vehicles. Tracing possible routes Evan Reyes and Liam Porter could have taken if something had gone wrong after dawn. The campsite was treated as the center point. Investigators photographed the tent from multiple angles, noting its condition, the placement of gear, and the absence of packed equipment. The sleeping area told a restrained story. No rips, no blood, no signs of panic. Just interruption. The ranger who first discovered the empty tent reported the odd stillness of the scene, as though time had paused mid-motion. Attention shifted outward. Within a few yards of the tent, the ground showed subtle scuffing disturbed dust where weight had pressed more firmly than a casual step. A shallow drag mark cut across the soil, faint but continuous for several feet before breaking apart among rocks. Nearby, flattened scrub suggested someone had paused or knelt, compressing vegetation that normally resisted being bent without effort. Footprints emerged farther out. At least one set was clearly adult-sized and did not match the tread patterns of Evan or Liam's boots. The impressions moved away from the campsite toward a narrow access path that paralleled the trail, but was not part of the official hiking route. In the dry desert soil, the prints held just long enough to be photographed and cast. Though the tools available in 2012 limited how much detail could be preserved, search teams expanded quickly. 8 to 9 units were brought in, their handlers moving carefully to avoid contaminating the area. The dogs picked up a scent trail that aligned with the direction of the unfamiliar footprints, leading away from the campsite before fading into harder ground where scent no longer held. Helicopter sweeps followed, scanning ridges, ravines, and dry washes for any sign of movement, fabric, or disturbed terrain. Volunteers combed the surrounding landscape on foot. Lines of people moved slowly through scrub and stone, eyes trained on the ground. pausing whenever something out of place caught their attention. Water sources were checked. Drop-offs were scanned for signs of a fall. Every plausible accident scenario was explored, then quietly set aside when no evidence supported it. As daylight waned, the reality of the situation settled in. Two experienced hikers had not simply wandered off. The evidence clustered too tightly near the campsite, pointing away from accident and toward human involvement. The lack of struggle did not bring comfort. It raised harder questions about control and timing. By evening, investigators regrouped. The desert cooled again, shadows lengthening across the same ground that had offered no answers at dawn. Search maps were marked with cleared zones, and plans were made to continue through the night. Yet, even as effort intensified, a shared understanding took hold among those closest to the case. Whatever had happened to Evan, Reyes, and Liam Porter had happened quickly, deliberately, and close to where they slept. By the third day of searching, the language surrounding Evan Reyes and Liam Porter's disappearance hardened into something more precise and more troubling. Back at the ranger station, investigators spread photographs, footprint casts, and hand-drawn maps across long tables. What they were seeing no longer supported the idea of a wilderness mishap. The evidence pointed inward, toward the campsite itself, and outward, along a controlled path away from it. The case was formally reclassified as an abduction-related missing persons investigation, a rare designation in a park where most disappearances ended with rescue or recovery. The absence of a struggle did not soften that conclusion. It sharpened it. Whoever had removed Evan and Liam from their tent had done so with speed and authority, in a way that minimized noise and resistance. That alone suggested planning. Investigators began assembling a list of individuals who could have been in the area without drawing attention. Park employees, seasonal workers, contractors, and people with permits for off-trail access were reviewed first. Maintenance logs were checked. Vehicle access records were compared against the narrow window of time between 9:40 p.m. and sunrise. Rangers interviewed hikers who had camped nearby, asking about headlights, voices, or movement during the night. One individual emerged as a prime suspect. They had legitimate access to service paths near the campsite, familiarity with the terrain, and a timeline that placed them in the general vicinity during the early hours of that morning. Their explanation for their movements shifted slightly with each retelling, subtle enough to seem human, troubling enough to invite scrutiny. Investigators conducted a thorough interview, walking carefully through the suspect's account of the night, comparing it against physical evidence and park records. The inconsistencies raised concern, but concern alone was not enough. A deeper review revealed a critical mismatch. The suspect's footwear could not have produced the unfamiliar prints documented near the campsite. Further, a verifiable record placed them miles away during the narrowest window when the abduction likely occurred. Reluctantly, methodically, the suspect was removed from primary consideration. Search efforts continued for weeks. The radius expanded far beyond the initial perimeter, stretching into harsh terrain where recovery was unlikely even under ideal conditions. State authorities reviewed the case and noted the absence of ransom demands, communication, or any indication that the disappearance was meant to draw attention. The assessment suggested a controlled act carried out by someone comfortable, operating unnoticed in remote spaces. Eventually, reality imposed limits. Resources thinned. New leads failed to materialize. The desert offered nothing more. The decision to move the case to inactive status was administrative, but its impact was deeply human. Rangers who had walked the same ground day after day carried the weight of unanswered questions. Families and friends of Evan and Liam struggled with a grief that never resolved into certainty. There was no moment of finality, only an enduring absence. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The case file was labeled, boxed, and shelved its contents preserved but untouched. In a storage room lined with metal racks and fluorescent lights, the names Evan Reyes and Liam Porter joined a quiet row of unresolved stories, waiting without any promise of return. Years passed in increments that felt insignificant to the file but enormous to the world around it. Big Bend National Park changed in subtle ways. Trails were rerouted. New signage appeared. Technology crept into places that once relied on paper logs and radio check-ins. Rangers retired. New ones arrived, learning the park's dangers through training manuals rather than lived memory. The desert itself remained constant, indifferent to time, holding its silence as faithfully as ever. The case file labeled with Evan Reyes and Liam Porter's names did not disappear. It survived because someone insisted it should. During office moves and storage reorganizations, the box was transferred carefully, its contents inventoried but never fully revisited. Once, during a flood that threatened the lower level of the ranger station, staff rushed to elevate older files. Another time, during a digitization effort, the file was nearly flagged for summary-only retention, its physical evidence deemed unlikely to yield future value. Each time, by chance or quiet conviction, it remained intact. Inside the box were photographs fading at the edges, brittle evidence bags sealed with aging tape, handwritten notes that recorded times, impressions, and doubts. There were casts of footprints whose significance could not be fully realized with the tools available in 2012. There were fibers collected from scrub near the campsite, cataloged and stored without the means to analyze them further. The box waited outside that storage room. Lives moved forward unevenly. Friends of Evan and Liam marked milestones with a lingering absence. Birthdays passed without resolution. Anniversaries of the disappearance arrived each year, reopening questions that had never been closed. Some people held on to hope with determination. Others learned to live around it, carrying the uncertainty like a background ache. Investigators who had worked a case early on carried it differently. One ranger, long since retired, kept a photocopy of the campsite map in a desk drawer at home, unable to let go of the feeling that something essential had been missed. They replayed the evidence in their mind, wondering whether a detail dismissed as insignificant might someday matter as the years accumulated. The case became a story told quietly to new staff, a cautionary example of how quickly certainty could dissolve in remote terrain. Officially, it was inactive. Emotionally, it never fully settled. Somewhere else, far from the desert, another life unfolded under a different name. That life remained invisible to the file, unconnected by any system capable of bridging the gap. The distance between what was known and what was true stretched across years, sustained by the limitations of the time. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The box stayed on the shelf, a silent witness preserved not by intention, but by persistence and chance, waiting for a moment when the past would finally intersect with the present. For years after the disappearance, the lives of Evan Reyes and Liam Porter were spoken about only in the past tense. In reports and memories, they remained frozen in 2012, two capable backpackers lost to a landscape that never explained itself. What no record captured was that one of them continued living, moving forward under a name that did not belong to them, carrying a history that felt incomplete but could not be articulated. Under this false identity, life unfolded in fragments rather than continuity. Documents existed, but they were thin. A birth record that appeared late. Identification issued without the deep trail of corroboration that modern systems would later require. Employment forms filled out with vague answers about childhood and family. Each explanation was plausible enough to pass, especially in earlier years when cross-jurisdiction databases did not speak to one another. Outwardly, there was nothing dramatic. Housing work, routine medical care. Yet an internal dislocation persisted. Certain sensory details triggered reactions that made no sense. The smell of dust after rain, the scrape of boot saws on stone, the sound of wind passing through open space at night. These moments arrived without context, followed by a quiet unease that never fully resolved. Dreams sometimes carried unfamiliar terrain, wide, arid, star-filled, followed by waking confusion and an inability to explain why those images felt personal. No one around them knew what to question. Teachers, co-workers, and acquaintances noticed an emotional distance, a reluctance to discuss early life, but nothing rose to the level of concern. Systems were not designed to interrogate absence. They were designed to process what was presented. Time moved forward, and with it came a moment that required compliance with a modern process. Years after 2012, a routine administrative necessity arose, one that required biometric submission. Fingerprints were taken. A DNA sample was collected. It was procedural, brief, and unremarkable, conducted in a setting far removed from desert campsites and search grids. When that data entered a national database, it did not remain anonymous for long. An automated system flagged a match, one that linked the newly submitted biometric profile to trace evidence preserved from a 2012 crime scene in Big Bend National Park. The alert was immediate and unequivocal. The dormant file bearing the names Evan Reyes and Liam Porter was reactivated within seconds, its status shifting from archived to urgent. In an office thousands of miles from the desert, a modern investigator saw the notification appear on a screen. They pulled the case number, requested the physical file, and waited as a box, long untouched, was retrieved from storage. The past, held in brittle paper and aging evidence bags, was about to be reread with tools that did not exist when the desert first went silent. The modern cold case investigator approached the file with a practiced restraint born from experience. Cases like this required patience, not momentum. When the box arrived from storage, its exterior showed the quiet wear of time-creased cardboard, fading ink, evidence tags written by hands long retired. Inside, the contents were arranged exactly as they had been left years earlier, preserved by protocol rather than hope. The investigator began at the beginning. Photographs from the campsite were scanned and digitized, each image enhanced to reveal details that had once been invisible. Footprint casts were re-examined, their tread patterns run through updated databases that cataloged footwear by manufacturer, year, and intended use. What had once been an indistinct sole now pointed toward a specific category of boot, commonly issued to people whose work required off-trail movement in rugged environments. Fibers collected near the tent were sent to a modern lab. Under advanced analysis, they revealed a blend of materials inconsistent with standard hiking gear. Soil samples, long considered too generic to matter, were compared against updated geological maps. Their composition aligned not only with the campsite, but with a secondary location tied to service routes rarely used by the public. The investigator built a merged timeline, overlaying the disappearance window with personnel records, maintenance schedules, and access logs from 2012. Patterns emerged where none had been visible before. One adult from Evan and Liam's earlier environment, someone with legitimate access, familiarity with the terrain, and an ability to move unnoticed, appeared repeatedly in proximity to critical moments. Their presence had been documented, but never connected. That individual's life was reconstructed piece by piece. Employment records placed them in the region. Housing data confirmed proximity to service paths. Travel gaps aligned with the narrow window during which Evan and Liam vanished. The evidence did not suggest impulse. It suggested opportunity, recognized and acted upon calmly. By the time the analysis concluded, the case had shifted shape entirely. Authorities determined that the adult whose biometric data had triggered the alert was not a suspect at all, but one of the missing hikers alive, misidentified, and unknowingly carrying proof of their own disappearance. Parallel evidence converged on the abductor, whose actions in 2012 could now be named and understood, even if accountability would never take the form of a courtroom. With the offender formally identified in the reopened file, the investigator prepared for the most delicate step. The person living under a false identity would need to be told that their life, as they understood it, was built on an erasure, that they had a name already, a history already written, and a place where people had been waiting for answers for years. The moment of truth did not arrive with drama or ceremony. It came in a quiet room, delivered carefully by professionals trained to explain facts without breaking the people receiving them. The person who had lived for years under a false identity was told that their fingerprints and DNA did not belong to the name they had used for most of their life. They were told that those markers matched evidence collected in 2012 from a campsite in Big Bend National Park, tied to the disappearance of two backpackers. At first, the information resisted meaning. Shock settled in before understanding could. The idea that an ordinary administrative requirement had reopened a life buried 14 years earlier felt unreal, almost intrusive. Then fragments began to align. The unexplained familiarity with desert terrain, the recurring dreams of wide skies and stone, the discomfort with questions about childhood. What had once felt like personal deficiencies slowly revealed themselves as evidence of something stolen. Authorities explained, in careful summary, that the biometric match identified them as one of the missing hikers. Evan Reyes, or Liam Porter, was no longer a name on a box in storage. It was a living person, sitting across from them, struggling to reconcile memory with revelation. DNA confirmation followed. Samples were collected from surviving biological relatives' family members who had lived with uncertainty for more than a decade. When the results came back, the science removed all remaining doubt. The genetic markers aligned unmistakably. Blood relation confirmed what technology had first suggested. The missing was no longer missing. The first reunion unfolded without spectacle. Faces met cautiously, each searching the other for recognition that could not be immediate. There were moments of silence heavy with expectation, followed by small details that bridged the years. A familiar gesture, a way of holding their hands when anxious, a scar remembered but never explained. These fragments did not restore the past, but they anchored the present. For the returned hiker, joy arrived tangled with grief. The life lived under a false name could not be erased, yet it could not remain separate either. Two identities pressed against one another, demanding integration rather than choice. For the family, relief was inseparable from anger and sorrow. 14 years had been taken, replaced by questions that would never fully resolve. When the cold case investigator marked the file as resolved, the action felt procedural, almost inadequate. Resolution in records did not equate to healing in people. Still, the truth had been restored. Names had been returned to their rightful place, and the silence that had followed the disappearance was finally broken, replaced by a truth that, while late, could no longer be denied. With the identity of the missing hiker confirmed, authorities moved to formally close a case that had lingered unresolved since 2012. Official records were amended. The disappearance of Evan Reyes and Liam Porter was reclassified, no longer framed as a wilderness mystery, but as an abduction carried out under the cover of familiarity and access. The offender, identified through the convergence of modern forensic analysis and historical records, was named in the file as the primary abductor. By the time the truth emerged, that individual was beyond the reach of prosecution, leaving accountability to documentation rather than trial. Some questions could never be answered with certainty. Investigators could infer motive only through patterns and circumstance. The abduction appeared calculated, shaped by opportunity rather than impulse, exploiting trust in systems that assumed remoteness equated to safety. Whether the offender intended to take one person or two, or whether the situation escalated beyond their control, remained unclear. The absence of a body for the second hiker left an enduring void, one that no amount of administrative closure could fill. There was also the unavoidable question of whether anything could have been done differently in 2012. By the standards of the time, investigators acted with diligence and care. Evidence was preserved. Witness accounts were documented, even when they lacked clarity. The failure was not one of effort, but of limitation. Systems then were not designed to connect fragments across decades or jurisdictions. That gap, more than any individual mistake, allowed the truth to remain buried. The case underscored the quiet power of evidence preservation. Items once considered inconclusive became decisive years later. Footprints, fibers, soil details too small to solve the case at the time gained meaning when technology caught up. It also reaffirmed the importance of documenting early observations, even when they seem uncertain. In cases like this, the smallest details often wait the longest to speak. For the returned hiker, justice did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as restoration. A name reclaimed, a history acknowledged, a life recontextualized, not as a series of inexplicable gaps, but as a story interrupted by force and later corrected by truth. For the families, closure came with complexity, relief braided tightly with grief. For years that could not be recovered, cold cases rarely end with triumph. More often, they conclude with a quiet reckoning, an understanding that truth matters even when it comes too late to undo harm. In Big Bend, the desert remains unchanged, holding its silence as it always has. But the story it once concealed now stands fully told. A reminder that even in the most remote places, answers can survive, waiting patiently for the moment they are finally heard. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.